glory of God is a human being fully alive, said St. Irenaeus. This morning's text says that God did not give us a spirit of timidity, but one that is powerful, loving, and self-controlled. Because fear is that thing that keeps us from being fully alive. And what I want to do with my time here this morning is not focus negatively on fear, but rather to discuss courage. How nothing else will make you feel that alive as when courage wells up from within you. Let me quote an unlikely source on this, the author Meg Cabot, who wrote The Princess Diaries and a plethora of books for all ages. Here's what she once said of courage. Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the judgment that something is more important than fear. That's only half of the quote she gives us on that subject, but I want to start with that much. Not the absence of fear is courage, but rather the judgment that something's more important than fear. Now, I want to pose that as a possible way of wrestling fear down. Paul tells Timothy that he knows he possesses a precious legacy that has been handed down to him by two women, his grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice. Well, similarly, this morning I want to tell the stories of two women as a way of putting flesh on the bones of courage. One of these is a biblical heroine, and the other is a woman who came to our nation's attention briefly back in the 1960s. First, the biblical story, the story of a woman named Esther. She lived in Persia at the time of a king whose name was Ahasuerus. Now, this king acted like most kings do, as if only his will mattered. Most people went with the flow, times being good, but there was one person in his kingdom who just couldn't abide that. It was, in fact, his first wife, and her name was Vashti. Now, Vashti was way ahead of her time. She didn't like being ordered around. She had her own agenda. And look, ancient Persia would become Iran, right? Where women have always shown a lot of gumption, like today. I'm watching Iran's women with great interest today, and I'm worried sick about them, knowing what they're up against from the men there. Well, anyway, Queen Vashti's behavior didn't please the king's chief minister, whose name was Haman. And Haman advised the king to banish the queen. If the king of Persia couldn't get his own queen to obey him, there would be trouble in the provinces, he said. Wives all over Persia might start doing whatever they wanted. This was unacceptable to the king's men, so the queen was banished. But there had to be a queen. And scouts were sent into the countryside to spot queenly young women. And the king would then choose one of the finalists to be the new queen. Well, Haman knew his king. He knew that the king would choose on the basis of beauty alone. Haman hoped that the king would choose a woman who might be as useful to him as she was beautiful to the king. And among the women, among those finalists was Esther. And when the king saw her, he loved her more than all the other women, and she found grace and favor in his sight. So he made her queen, according to the text. And though the king didn't know it, Esther was an orphan, a Jew, in fact, in care of her uncle, a wise man named Mordecai. And though you might have guessed that Mordecai would have frowned on this match, he actually approves, even though the man was not of her faith or her people. And though God's name is never, ever mentioned in the book of Esther, it is clear to anyone reading it that Mordecai was curious as to whether God might be at work in this marriage. Maybe God has a special role for Esther to play. Times could not have been tougher for Jews there. Haman had secretly hatched a plan to kill all the Jews in Persia. He knew that though they seemed loyal to the nation, they were first loyal to their own God. So Haman set a date for their mass execution, a final solution, if you will. and even had a secret underground gallows built for the purpose. And then, being an operator, Haman slithered up to the king and said the following: "Dear king, it's come to our attention that there's a certain ethnic group in your kingdom that considers themselves above your laws. Allow me to be of service and let me kill them off." And the king, being kind of a simpleton and not too interested in the day-to-day workings of his realm, said, "Go ahead." And like water through limestone, the news leaked its way through the power structure as it always does and came to the Jews. And Mordecai wasted no time. He sent word to his niece in the palace telling her what was about to unfold, and he begged her to help. Esther sent word back to him quickly saying, "Who am I to go to the king and plead for my people? Besides, the king hasn't sent for me in over a month. I'm not sure he even favors me anymore. Queens come and go around here, you know," she said. "If I was to just show up in the throne room, the king might think I'm headstrong like his last queen and have me done with." Well, Esther hoped that'd be the last of it, and that Mordecai might find somebody else. But Mordecai could not forget the wonderful series of events that had put his niece so close to the seat of power at the time his people clearly needed a voice in a high place. So Mordecai sent a second word to her, reminding Esther that she was a Jew, and it wasn't beyond imagining that she too might be sent to Auschwitz or wherever Haman was going to do his dirty work. Besides, he said, maybe you've been put in the king's palace for just such a time as this. Maybe it's a God thing, he's saying. Esther was terribly frightened initially. She couldn't sleep, but then she got a certain clarity about her own life. Yes, she was a small person, and yes, this was a big thing. But she wondered if perhaps God liked to use the small when push came to shove. Maybe she was her people's only hope. So Esther takes a little time to think about it, and then, gaining a sense of purpose, out of recognition of her very smallness, she writes a note to her uncle saying, "Okay, I'll do it. And if I perish, I perish." That's it. Remember Meg Cabot's remark: courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the judgment that something is more important than fear. Esther was clearly terrified. That's why she begged off. But she thought it out. She reasoned that there was something more important than her fear, something more important, in fact, than her own life, and that was the life of her people. And here's the second part of Meg Cabot's word on courage. The brave may not live forever, but the cautious do not live at all. There are few things sadder than the person who realizes that a time had come in the past for them, a time that required courage, and they had not stepped up. Well, we all have those haunting memories, don't we? But the important thing is that hopefully we learn from them. We have determined that the next time we will answer the call. Why? Because when our lives are over, we don't want to have said, "I never stood up. I never really lived." Hear Paul's words again to Timothy. God didn't give us a spirit of timidity, but one that is powerful, loving, and self-controlled. Which brings to mind the words of Marianne Williamson that were made famous by Nelson Mandela, remember, who said, "Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us." We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? We ask ourselves, who am I? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God, and your playing small does not serve the world. Esther served the world, but so does anyone who steps up even for a small cause, who takes a stand, who speaks up when they hear someone else say something that is totally false, but is passing for true because no one speaks up. Now hear the rest of Marianne Williamson's words. There is nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people will not feel insecure around you. We are all meant to shine as children do. We were all born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. It is not just in some of us, she says. It is in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give others permission to do the same. And as we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others. The glory of God is a human being fully alive. Someone who has found a way to live beyond their fear. Now, I said I would tell a second story about a woman who lived beyond her fears. The story for me begins, in fact, with a man. The man's name was Robert Coles, a Harvard-trained child psychiatrist. You may never have heard of him. I'd long revered him for his deep humanism. I saw him once in April of 1992. It was a watershed moment for me. I have never heard any other person speak to my heart as clearly as he spoke that evening, and I haven't ever heard anything since to equal it. So let me begin this with maximum italics. In fact, it's one of the thrills of my life that he agreed to mentor me on a sabbatical I took 12 years later in 2004. Well, anyway, the venue I saw him in 92 was the Arlene Schnitzer Auditorium downtown. He was one of the Portland Arts and Lecture speakers that year. Dr. Coles spoke to us for a good hour and a half about his own life. He spoke of being part of the doctor's draft way back in 1960. He was stationed at the time in Biloxi, Mississippi, and had some business that had taken him into New Orleans one morning. He found himself stopped by a police roadblock. Hundreds of people surrounded an elementary school building, the William Frantz Elementary School. It was being integrated that day. A little girl named Ruby Bridges, 6 years old, was to be the first black student to attend that school. 6 years old, all by herself, because the white parents decided to keep their children home in protest. So Ruby came to school that morning wearing a white dress, white shoes, white socks with a white bow in her hair. The crowd of people must have numbered 700 or 800. They jeered at her. They said they were going to get her. They told her that this would be her last day alive. A little 6-year-old girl. That day was among the lowest days, morally speaking, our nation has ever seen. Well, Dr. Coles had worked for 4 years with a lot of troubled kids before this time, before he accidentally happened into this roadblock. He had dealt with children stuck in iron lungs and children who had leukemia. He'd been impressed with their capacity at even a very young age for moral inquiry. He wondered how that little girl, Ruby Bridges, was going to stand up to the kind of pressure she was facing for days, weeks, months, a year maybe. He knew the kind of symptoms that might be evidenced in such a child, and he requested permission as a psychiatrist to spend time with Ruby, see if he could help her through it. So Dr. Coles visited with Ruby and her family several afternoons a week in her home. This went on for months. Every day the mob would assemble and taunt her, and every day she showed up school, ushered to the door by a phalanx of federal marshals. She did her homework, and she stood up to the ordeal wonderfully. Then one day, Dr. Coles got word from Ruby's teacher that there'd been an incident at the school. Her teacher said that Ruby had been talking to the mob assembled there and that they'd gotten very excited and the marshals had drawn their guns and forced Ruby inside the building. That afternoon, Dr. Coles went to see her and asked what had happened that morning. Ruby said nothing had happened. Dr. Coles said that the teacher had told him that Ruby had spoken to the people who were demonstrating against her, and things had gotten really ugly. Ruby said that she hadn't been talking to those people. Dr. Coles said that the teacher had seen it. Teacher had seen her lips moving, so if she wasn't talking to those people, who was she talking to? Ruby said that she was talking to God. Now, Dr. Coles told us that he had dealt with a number of people in psychiatric hospitals who talked to God, but he couldn't figure out why a little 6-year-old girl would be doing that, especially outside a school in New Orleans in 1960. Ruby said that she often talked to God. She said she had made a deal, in fact, with the federal marshals to stop a couple of blocks away from the school every morning and let her talk to God. But this morning she had forgotten until she had seen the mob. What about the mob made you remember? Asked Dr. Coles. Ruby said, because I was praying for them. Why? Asked Dr. Coles. Ruby said, don't you think they need praying for? Dr. Coles said, well, maybe, but why should you be the one? Ruby said, because I'm the one who hears what they say. Dr. Coles asked Ruby what she said when she prayed to them, prayed for them. She said, I always pray the same thing. I always say, God, please forgive those people because they don't know what they're doing. Dr. Coles then told us there at the Schnitzer that those words she said sounded familiar to him. He knew that sometime in the history of the world, someone had said those words before. Ruby told Dr. Coles about Jesus and the mob that he had had to face. He only faced his mob once, but she had to face her mob of hundreds of people twice a day, 5 days a week, for months on end. And hear their taunts. They were on a mission to wear her down, and she knew that. And she was only 6 years old. She said that her mother and her grandmother had said that was a good prayer to pray. And she thought it was a good prayer to say too. And in the church that they all went to every Sunday, that was the prayer that they said every week when they prayed for the mob. Dr. Coles said to us sitting there in the Arlene Schnitzer Auditorium that evening in 1992, he said, and I wrote these words down. He said, you know, Ruby's parents couldn't read or write. Her mother left home after dinner every night and went downtown to an office building where she scrubbed floors and then came home, caught a few hours sleep, and then was up to get her family off to school and work the next morning. Her father was a janitor. Ruby had never before seen a doctor until she saw Dr. Coles. We would call them, Dr. Coles said, we would call them culturally disadvantaged today. But who is disadvantaged, really? Ruby's parents, though illiterate, knew much of the Bible by heart. They knew Jeremiah and Amos and Isaiah. They knew all about Jesus. They knew that he had never stayed at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, never went to Harvard University. They knew he had written no books and kept rather lousy company according to certain standards. Blind, lame. This Ruby knew. This Ruby and her parents took to heart. Dr. Coles asked us that night, what do children need? Food, clothing, a home, love. Yes, but love is not enough. Ruby's parents felt that Ruby needed moral purpose, someone to believe in that was bigger than she was, someone who had gone through everything she had to go through in life and more, and whose character had come through intact. We know that because of what he said from the cross. Robert Coles finished talking about Jesus and Ruby by saying simply, I don't know what we can do to be worthy of that, but I think we ought to try. God did not give us a spirit of timidity, but one that is powerful and loving and self-controlled. And when we remember that, and have a family or a faith community like this one that reminds us of that, it can make all the difference in the world, especially when you live in times like Ruby did. Yes, and in times just like this. Amen.